The sun was just beginning to rise over the small coastal town of Brighton on that peaceful Tuesday morning. Golden rays of light danced across the quiet streets while most people were still sleeping in their warm beds. The air smelled fresh and clean with a hint of salt from the nearby ocean. Birds chirped softly in the old oak trees that lined the neighborhood streets. Everything felt perfect and calm. Marcus stretched his legs and yawned as he woke up in Mrs. Henderson's cozy living room. The beautiful golden retriever had been staying with a kind elderly woman for the past 3 weeks. His thick golden fur caught the morning sunlight streaming through the window, making him look like he was glowing. Marcus had warm brown eyes that sparkled with intelligence and kindness. His pink tongue hung out slightly as he panted with excitement for the new day ahead. Mrs. Henderson was already awake in her kitchen, making her morning tea. She was a sweet woman in her 70s with silver hair and gentle blue eyes. She wore a flowered apron over her simple dress and hummed an old song while she worked. The smell of fresh biscuits filled the air. She had promised to take good care of Marcus while his real owner was away working on a movie in another country. She treated the dog like he was her own grandchild. Marcus walked over to his food bowl and ate his breakfast quickly. His tail wagged back and forth with happiness. He loved staying with Mrs. Henderson because she always gave him extra treats and spoke to him in a soft, loving voice. After finishing his food, Marcus went to the back door and scratched it gently with his paw. This was his way of asking to go outside for his morning walk. Mrs. Henderson opened the door, and Marcus bounded out into the small garden behind her house. The grass was still wet with morning dew that sparkled like tiny diamonds. Marcus sniffed around the flower beds and wagged his tail when he caught the scent of a rabbit that had visited during the night. He was a gentle dog who never chased or hurt any small animals. He just enjoyed exploring and discovering new smells. The neighborhood was incredibly quiet at this early hour. Most of the houses had their curtains still closed. A few early birds flew overhead, heading toward the ocean to look for fish. The street lamps were beginning to turn off automatically as the natural daylight grew stronger. Marcus could hear the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore about half a mile away. Mrs. Henderson watched Marcus through her kitchen window as she sipped her tea. She smiled at how happy and carefree the dog looked. He had no idea that danger was heading toward their peaceful neighborhood. She had no idea either. If she had known what was about to happen, she would have kept Marcus safely inside her house. Marcus decided to explore beyond the small garden. He squeezed through a gap in the fence that Mrs. Henderson did not know about. The dog was curious and wanted to see more of the town. He had walked these streets many times before and knew they were safe. The neighbors all knew him and often stopped to pet him and give him treats. As Marcus trotted down the sidewalk, his collar made a soft, jingling sound with each step. The collar was made of strong brown leather with a silver tag that had his name engraved on it. His paws made small clicking sounds on the concrete. He stopped to sniff at a fire hydrant and then continued walking toward the town center. The morning was so peaceful that Marcus felt completely relaxed and happy. He had no reason to be afraid or worried. This was his neighborhood, and these were his streets. He knew every house and every yard. The mailman would wave at him in a few hours. The children would pet him on their way to school. The shopkeepers would offer him water on hot days. But something was about to change. In the distance, Marcus could hear a new sound that he had never heard before in this quiet neighborhood. It was a low rumbling noise that was getting louder and louder. The sound was coming from several motorcycle engines, but Marcus did not understand what that meant. He just kept walking forward with his tail wagging, completely unaware that 5 dangerous men were heading straight toward him. The rumbling sound grew louder and louder until it became a roar that echoed through the quiet streets of Brighton. 5 large motorcycles turned the corner and entered the peaceful neighborhood like thunder rolling across the sky. The bikes were black and chrome with loud exhaust pipes that disturbed the morning calm. Birds stopped singing and flew away from the trees. Dogs hiding in yards began to bark nervously. The leader of this gang rode in front on the biggest motorcycle of all. His name was Tank, and he looked exactly like his nickname suggested. He was a huge man with thick arms covered in dark tattoos from his wrists to his shoulders. His face was rough and mean with small dark eyes that seemed to enjoy causing trouble. Tank wore a black leather jacket with patches and studs all over it. On the back of his jacket were the words "Road Devils" written in red letters that looked like flames. Behind Tank rode his 4 friends who were just as mean and dangerous as their leader. Snake was thin and tall with a long ponytail and a beard that reached his chest. His arms were covered with tattoos of snakes and skulls. Razor had a shaved head and scars on his face from old fights. Bull was almost as big as Tank with a thick neck and hands like hammers. Viper was the youngest of the group, but his eyes were cold and cruel like a reptile. All 5 men wore the same black leather jackets with the Road Devils patches. Their boots were heavy and made loud sounds when they walked. They wore dark sunglasses even though the morning sun was not very bright yet. Gold chains hung around their necks and rings covered their fingers. They looked like they had not taken a bath or shaved in many days. The Road Devils were known throughout the region for causing problems wherever they went. They would ride into quiet towns and disturb the peace just for fun. They enjoyed scaring people and making trouble. Police in several towns were looking for them, but the gang was always careful to move from place to place before getting caught. Tank raised his thick arm in the air and made a fist. This was the signal for the other bikers to slow down and stop their motorcycles. The engines became quieter, but still rumbled like angry beasts. Tank pulled off his sunglasses and looked around the neighborhood with his small, mean eyes. He was searching for something or someone to bother. The peaceful morning had been completely destroyed by the arrival of these 5 dangerous men. The sound of their motorcycles had woken up several neighbors who looked out their windows with worried faces. Children who had been getting ready for school now hid behind their parents. Even the mail carrier turned around and walked quickly in the other direction. Snake pointed down the street and said something to Tank that made the big man smile in a very unpleasant way. Tank nodded his head and started his motorcycle again. The other 4 bikers did the same thing. They had found their target for the morning, and they were excited about the cruel fun they were planning to have. The Road Devils rode slowly down the street now like hunters looking for prey. Their engines rumbled quietly, but the sound was still threatening and scary. They moved in a line with Tank in front and the others following behind him. Their eyes searched every yard and every sidewalk, looking for someone weak and helpless to pick on. Marcus was still walking happily down the sidewalk, completely unaware that 5 dangerous men were heading straight toward him. The innocent golden retriever had no idea that his peaceful morning walk was about to become a nightmare that would change everything. Marcus continued walking down the sidewalk with his tail wagging happily. The golden retriever had no idea that danger was approaching from behind. His collar jingled softly with each step as he sniffed at interesting smells along the way. A butterfly landed on a flower nearby, and Marcus watched it with curious eyes, but did not chase it because he was a gentle dog who never hurt any living creature. The rumbling sound of the motorcycles grew louder behind Marcus, but he was not afraid. The innocent dog had never met truly cruel people before. In his world, everyone was kind and friendly. When he heard the bikes getting closer, Marcus actually wagged his tail faster because he thought new friends were coming to visit him. Tank spotted the golden dog walking alone on the sidewalk, and his mean eyes lit up with cruel excitement. He raised his hand again to signal the other bikers to slow down. The 5 motorcycles formed a circle around Marcus, who stood in the middle looking up at them with trusting brown eyes. The dog's tail was still wagging, because he believed these strangers wanted to be his friends. Snake laughed in a nasty way and said something dirty that made the other bikers chuckle. Razor revved his motorcycle engine loudly, which made Marcus jump a little, but the dog still was not scared. Bull cracked his knuckles and smiled in a way that would frighten most people. Viper took off his sunglasses to get a better look at their victim. Tank climbed off his motorcycle and walked toward Marcus. The big man's heavy boots made loud sounds on the concrete. Marcus wagged his tail even harder and took a few steps toward Tank, thinking the man wanted to pet him. Dogs always believe the best about people until they learn otherwise the hard way. Without any warning, Tank pulled back his leg and kicked Marcus hard in the side. The sudden pain was so shocking that Marcus yelped loudly and fell over onto the sidewalk. The poor dog had never been hurt by a human before and could not understand why this was happening to him. His trusting brown eyes were now filled with fear and confusion. The other bikers laughed loudly at the dog's pain, which made them feel powerful and important. Snake got off his bike and pushed Marcus with his boot when the dog tried to stand up. Razor kicked dirt at the frightened animal. Vole and Viper joined in the cruel game by blocking Marcus every time he tried to run away. Marcus whimpered and cried as the 5 men surrounded him. He tried to make himself as small as possible by lying flat on the ground with his belly showing. This was how dogs showed they were not a threat and wanted the fighting to stop. But these evil men did not understand or care about dog language. Mrs. Henderson heard the terrible sounds coming from the street. She had been washing dishes in her kitchen when she heard Marcus yelping in pain. The elderly woman dropped her dish towel and ran to her front window. What she saw made her heart fill with anger and fear. Her beloved Marcus was surrounded by 5 big men who were hurting him for no reason at all. The gentle dog was trying to crawl away, but the men kept blocking his path with their motorcycles. Mrs. Henderson could see that Marcus was terrified and in pain. The brave old woman did not think about her own safety. She threw open her front door and ran outside as fast as her old legs could carry her. Mrs. Henderson was screaming at the top of her voice for the men to stop hurting the innocent dog. Her face was red with anger and her hands were shaking with rage. But the road devils just laughed at the elderly woman like she was part of their entertainment. Mrs. Henderson stood on her front porch, shaking with anger and fear as she watched the 5 motorcycles disappear down the street. The cruel men had finally gotten bored with hurting Marcus and had roared away laughing like it was all just a funny game to them. But for Mrs. Henderson and Marcus, it was not a game at all. It was a terrible nightmare that had destroyed their peaceful morning. Marcus limped slowly toward the house with his head hanging low and his beautiful golden fur dirty from being pushed around on the concrete. The poor dog was no longer the happy, confident animal who had walked out that morning. His tail was tucked between his legs, and he kept looking over his shoulder, as if he expected the bad men to come back. Every few steps, Marcus would whimper softly from the pain in his side where Tank had kicked him. Mrs. Henderson knelt down on her porch and opened her arms wide. Marcus came to her and put his head against her chest while she gently stroked his fur and whispered that everything would be okay now. But she could feel him trembling, and she knew that the dog had been hurt in ways that went deeper than just physical pain. Someone had broken his trust in people, and that was sometimes harder to heal than broken bones. The elderly woman helped Marcus into the house and gave him some water in his favorite bowl. She checked his body carefully for serious injuries and was relieved to find that nothing seemed to be broken. There were some bruises under his fur, and he was limping on his left front paw, but he would recover from those injuries with time and care. But Mrs. Henderson knew she had to call the police right away. She picked up her old telephone and dialed the emergency number with shaking fingers. When the police officer answered, she told him everything that had happened. She described the 5 men and their motorcycles in as much detail as she could remember. The officer said he would send someone to take a report, but Mrs. Henderson could tell from his voice that he did not think they would ever catch the men who had hurt Marcus. After she finished talking to the police, Mrs. Henderson realized she had to make another phone call that would be much more difficult. She walked to her refrigerator, where a small piece of paper was held by a magnet shaped like a bone. On the paper was written a phone number and the words, "In case of emergency, call this number immediately." Mrs. Henderson had hoped she would never need to use that number. She had promised to take perfect care of Marcus while his owner was away working. Now she had to admit that she had failed to protect the dog she loved so much. Her hands were still shaking as she dialed the international number. The phone rang twice before a man answered in a voice with a British accent. "Hello, Mrs. Henderson," the voice said warmly. "How is my boy Marcus doing today?" Usually this question made Mrs. Henderson smile, because she loved talking about Marcus and sharing stories about the funny things he did. But today was different. Mrs. Henderson took a deep breath and tried to keep her voice steady. "Something terrible has happened," she said. Then she told the whole story from the beginning. She described the 5 bikers and exactly what they had done to Marcus. She explained how scared and hurt the dog was now. There was complete silence on the other end of the phone for what felt like a very long time. When the man finally spoke again, his voice was completely different. It was cold and quiet and dangerous in a way that made Mrs. Henderson feel goosebumps on her arms, even though she was inside her warm house. "I will be there in 2 hours," the man said in that cold, quiet voice that Mrs. Henderson had never heard before. "Do not let Marcus out of your sight. Do not talk to any strangers. Lock your doors and windows until I arrive." Then the phone went silent. Mrs. Henderson stood holding the telephone for a long moment, wondering what kind of man could sound so calm yet so frightening at the same time. She had been taking care of Marcus for 3 weeks, but his owner had never visited during that time. They had only talked on the phone a few times, and he had always sounded kind and polite. Mrs. Henderson knew he was some kind of movie actor who traveled around the world for his work. She had seen a few pictures of him with Marcus, but she was not good with remembering faces from movies. Mrs. Henderson did exactly what the man had told her to do. She locked every door and window in her house. She closed all the curtains so nobody could see inside. She brought Marcus to the living room, where she could watch him carefully and make sure he was safe. The poor dog was still shaking and refused to eat the treats she offered him. 2 hours passed very slowly. Mrs. Henderson sat in her favorite chair next to Marcus and tried to comfort him by speaking in a soft, gentle voice. She told him that his real owner was coming home and everything would be better soon. But she was not sure if she believed her own words. The way the man had sounded on the phone made her think that things might get worse before they got better. At exactly 2 hours after the phone call, Mrs. Henderson heard a car door close outside her house. She peeked through her curtains and saw a black car parked in her driveway. A man got out of the car and walked toward her front door. He was not very tall and was wearing simple blue jeans and a plain white shirt. He looked like any ordinary person you might see at the grocery store or walking down the street. But there was something about the way he moved that was different from ordinary people. He walked with the confidence of someone who was never afraid of anything or anyone. His shoulders were straight and strong. His eyes looked carefully at everything around him as if he was always ready for trouble. Even though he was dressed like a regular person, there was something dangerous about him that Mrs. Henderson could feel even from inside her house. The man knocked on the front door 3 times in a pattern that sounded like a code. Mrs. Henderson unlocked the door and opened it slowly. When she saw his face up close, she suddenly realized who he was. She had seen him in action movies fighting bad guys and driving fast cars. But seeing him in person was completely different from seeing him on a movie screen. Jason Statham stepped into Mrs. Henderson's living room and immediately knelt down beside Marcus. The dog recognized his owner right away, and his tail wagged weakly for the first time since the attack. But Jason could see that his beloved pet was still scared and hurt. He ran his hands gently over Marcus's body, checking for injuries while speaking to the dog in a soft, loving voice. "Who did this to you, boy?" Jason whispered as he continued his examination. Marcus pressed his head against Jason's chest and whimpered softly. The dog felt safe now that his owner was here, but the fear was still in his eyes. Jason's jaw got tighter and tighter as he saw how much damage the bikers had done to his best friend. Mrs. Henderson told the whole story again, giving Jason every detail she could remember about the 5 men and their motorcycles. She described their faces, their clothes, and the words on their leather jackets. Jason listened without saying anything, but Mrs. Henderson could see that he was memorizing every single word she said. When she finished talking, Jason stood up slowly and looked toward the window that faced the street where the attack had happened. "They hurt my family," he said in that same cold, quiet voice Mrs. Henderson had heard on the phone. "Nobody hurts my family and walks away." "I will be there in 2 hours, the man said in that cold, quiet voice that Mrs. Henderson had never heard before. Do not let Marcus out of your sight. Do not talk to any strangers. Lock your doors and windows until I arrive." Then the phone went silent. Mrs. Henderson stood holding the telephone for a long moment, wondering what kind of man could sound so calm yet so frightening at the same time. She had been taking care of Marcus for 3 weeks, but his owner had never visited during that time. They had only talked on the phone a few times, and he had always sounded kind and polite. Mrs. Henderson knew he was some kind of movie actor who traveled around the world for his work. She had seen a few pictures of him with Marcus, but she was not good with remembering faces from movies. Mrs. Henderson did exactly what the man had told her to do. She locked every door and window in her house. She closed all the curtains so nobody could see inside. She brought Marcus to the living room, where she could watch him carefully and make sure he was safe. The poor dog was still shaking and refused to eat the treats she offered him. 2 hours passed very slowly. Mrs. Henderson sat in her favorite chair next to Marcus and tried to comfort him by speaking in a soft, gentle voice. She told him that his real owner was coming home and everything would be better soon. But she was not sure if she believed her own words. The way the man had sounded on the phone made her think that things might get worse before they got better. At exactly 2 hours after the phone call, Mrs. Henderson heard a car door close outside her house. She peeked through her curtains and saw a black car parked in her driveway. A man got out of the car and walked toward her front door. He was not very tall and was wearing simple blue jeans and a plain white shirt. He looked like any ordinary person you might see at the grocery store or walking down the street. But there was something about the way he moved that was different from ordinary people. He walked with the confidence of someone who was never afraid of anything or anyone. His shoulders were straight and strong. His eyes looked carefully at everything around him, as if he was always ready for trouble. Even though he was dressed like a regular person, there was something dangerous about him that Mrs. Henderson could feel even from inside her house. The man knocked on the front door 3 times in a pattern that sounded like a code. Mrs. Henderson unlocked the door and opened it slowly. When she saw his face up close, she suddenly realized who he was. She had seen him in action movies fighting bad guys and driving fast cars. But seeing him in person was completely different from seeing him on a movie screen. Jason Statham stepped into Mrs. Henderson's living room and immediately knelt down beside Marcus. The dog recognized his owner right away, and his tail wagged weakly for the first time since the attack. But Jason could see that his beloved pet was still scared and hurt. He ran his hands gently over Marcus's body, checking for injuries, while speaking to the dog in a soft, loving voice. "Who did this to you, boy?" Jason whispered as he continued his examination. Marcus pressed his head against Jason's chest and whimpered softly. The dog felt safe now that his owner was here, but the fear was still in his eyes. Jason's jaw got tighter and tighter as he saw how much damage the bikers had done to his best friend. Mrs. Henderson told the whole story again, giving Jason every detail she could remember about the 5 men and their motorcycles. She described their faces, their clothes, and the words on their leather jackets. Jason listened without saying anything, but Mrs. Henderson could see that he was memorizing every single word she said. When she finished talking, Jason stood up slowly and looked toward the window that faced the street where the attack had happened. "They hurt my family," he said in that same cold, quiet voice Mrs. Henderson had heard on the phone. "Nobody hurts my family," and walks away. Jason spent the rest of that day moving through the small town like a ghost. Nobody noticed him as he quietly gathered information about the road devils. He had changed into dark clothes and a baseball cap that hid most of his face. Years of playing dangerous characters in movies had taught him how to blend in and how to find people who did not want to be found. His first stop was the gas station on the edge of town. Jason bought a bottle of water and chatted with the young man behind the counter. Without seeming too interested, he asked if any motorcycle gangs had been through town recently. The young man's eyes lit up with excitement as he told Jason about the 5 scary bikers who had bought gas that morning and bragged about causing trouble in the nice neighborhood. Next, Jason visited the local diner where truckers and travelers often stopped for food. He sat at the counter and ordered coffee while listening to conversations around him. An older waitress mentioned to another customer that some bikers had been asking about places to stay for a few days. She had recommended the old motel outside town, but warned them to behave themselves or the owner would call the police. Jason left money for his coffee and drove to the motel. He parked across the street and watched through his car window. Sure enough, 5 motorcycles were parked outside one of the rooms. Through the thin walls, he could hear loud voices laughing and music playing. These men had no idea that someone was hunting them. They felt safe and thought they could do whatever they wanted without any consequences. But Jason was not ready to confront them yet. He needed more information about their plans and their habits. He drove to the town bar where motorcycle gangs often gathered to drink and cause trouble. The bartender was a big man with tattoos who looked like he had seen plenty of fights in his establishment. Jason ordered a beer and struck up a conversation with the bartender. He mentioned that he had heard some bikers were in town and wondered if they were the type who caused problems. The bartender shook his head and said the Road Devils were bad news who had been banned from most bars in the area. But he had heard they were planning to stay in town for a few more days before moving on to their next target. As the evening grew darker, Jason learned more and more about the 5 men who had hurt Marcus. Other customers in the bar shared stories about encounters with the Road Devils. Everyone agreed that Tank was the leader and the most dangerous of the group. Snake was the smartest and usually planned their crimes. Razor was the most violent and enjoyed hurting people. Bull was stupid but very strong. Viper was young and trying to prove himself by being as cruel as the others. Jason also learned that the Road Devils had a pattern. They would arrive in a small town and spend a few days causing trouble before moving on. They liked to pick on people who could not fight back, like elderly people, children, and animals. They thought it was funny to scare innocent victims and then disappear before the police could catch them. But the most important information Jason gathered was about their Friday night tradition. Every Friday night, the Road Devils would gather at an abandoned warehouse outside whatever town they were visiting. They would drink beer, plan their next crimes, and celebrate the trouble they had caused during the week. The warehouse gave them privacy and space to make as much noise as they wanted without bothering anyone. Jason smiled grimly as he drove back to Mrs. Henderson's house. Friday was tomorrow night, and he now knew exactly where to find the 5 men who had terrorized his beloved Marcus. He had a plan forming in his mind that would teach the Road Devils a lesson they would never forget. When Jason arrived back at the house, he found Marcus sleeping peacefully on his favorite blanket. Mrs. Henderson had been taking excellent care of the injured dog, giving him medicine for his pain and lots of love and attention. Marcus was already starting to feel a little better, but Jason could see that the dog was still nervous and jumpy. Jason knelt beside Marcus and gently petted his golden fur. "Tomorrow night, boy," he whispered, "those bad men are going to learn what happens when they mess with our family." Friday night arrived with dark clouds covering the moon and a cold wind blowing through the empty streets. The abandoned warehouse sat on the outskirts of town like a sleeping monster made of rusted metal and broken windows. Inside the building, the Road Devils were having their weekly celebration, completely unaware that death was waiting for them in the shadows outside. Jason had arrived at the warehouse 2 hours before the bikers got there. He had studied the building during the day and knew every entrance and exit. He had positioned himself in the perfect spot where he could see everything but remain hidden until he was ready to make his move. The skills he had learned for his action movies were now being put to use in real life. Tank was in the middle of telling a story to his gang about their week of causing trouble. His loud voice echoed through the empty warehouse as he bragged about the different people they had scared and the property they had damaged. When he got to the part about kicking the golden dog, all 5 men started laughing like it was the funniest thing they had ever heard. "You should have seen that stupid dog try to run away," Tank said, while taking a long drink from his beer bottle. "It was crying like a little baby when we were done with it." Snake added his own cruel comments about how scared the old woman had looked when she tried to protect the animal. The other bikers laughed even harder and slapped each other on the back. Jason stepped out of the shadows and into the light of their campfire. At first the five men did not pay much attention to him. They saw an ordinary-looking man in dark clothes and assumed he was just some homeless person looking for a place to sleep. Tank waved his hand dismissively and told Jason to get lost before they made him sorry for bothering them. But Jason did not move. He stood perfectly still, looking at each of the five bikers with cold eyes that seemed to see right through them. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried clearly through the warehouse. "You kicked my dog," he said in a tone that made the temperature in the room seem to drop 10 degrees. The laughter stopped immediately. Snake was the first to recognize the face that had appeared in so many action movies. His mouth fell open, and he pointed a shaking finger at Jason. "Guys," he whispered in a voice filled with growing fear, "that is Jason Statham." The other bikers turned to look more carefully at the man standing before them, and slowly realized that Snake was right. Tank tried to act tough, even though his heart was starting to beat faster. "So what if you are some movie star?" he said, standing up from his chair. "This is the real world, not some Hollywood fantasy. There are 5 of us and only 1 of you." But Tank's voice was not as confident as his words. Something about the way Jason was standing made Tank feel nervous for the first time in years. Jason took a single step forward, and suddenly the atmosphere in the warehouse changed completely. The 5 bikers could sense that they were no longer the hunters but had become the prey. This was not some scared old woman or helpless animal they could push around. This was a man who had spent years training his body and mind to be a weapon. "My dog is family," Jason said, taking another step closer. He never hurt anyone in his whole life. He trusted people because he had never met anyone like you before. You taught him that humans can be cruel and evil. You broke his spirit just for fun. Jason's voice remained calm, but every word hit the bikers like a physical blow. Razor was the first to crack under the pressure. He reached for a broken bottle on the table, intending to use it as a weapon. But before his fingers could close around the glass, Jason moved faster than any of them thought possible. In one smooth motion, he crossed the distance between them, and Razor found himself on the ground wondering what had happened. The fight that followed would become legendary in the town's history, though none of the bikers would ever talk about it publicly. Tank rushed forward, trying to use his size and strength to overpower Jason, but found himself on the concrete floor within seconds. Snake tried to run for the exit, but discovered that the door seemed much farther away than he remembered. Bull swung his massive fists, but hit only empty air as Jason moved like water around his clumsy attacks. One by one, the Road Devils learned that their victim's owner was not someone they should have chosen to mess with. Within 10 minutes, all 5 members of the Road Devils were sitting on the cold concrete floor of the warehouse, looking up at Jason with expressions of shock, fear, and newfound respect. None of them had serious injuries, but each man now understood exactly how Marcus had felt when they surrounded and attacked him. They felt helpless, scared, and completely at the mercy of someone stronger than them. Tank, who had been so confident and cruel just minutes before, was now holding his bruised ribs and breathing heavily. His leather jacket was torn, and his face was dirty from where he had hit the ground. The big man who had enjoyed kicking an innocent dog was now afraid to look directly at Jason. All of his tough guy attitude had disappeared the moment he realized he was not the strongest person in the room. Snake was pressed against the wall, trying to make himself as small as possible. The man who usually planned the gang's cruel activities was now wishing he had never heard of the Road Devils. His long ponytail was messy, and his sunglasses were broken on the floor beside him. He kept glancing toward the exit, wondering if he could run away, but he was too scared to try. Razor was holding his head in his hands and groaning softly. The man who enjoyed violence so much had learned what it felt like to be on the receiving end of real fighting skills. His tough reputation meant nothing when faced with someone who actually knew how to fight properly. He felt dizzy and confused, and wanted nothing more than to go home and hide. Bull was the most confused of all the bikers. His simple mind could not understand how one man had defeated all 5 of them so easily. He had always relied on his size and strength to intimidate people, but now he realized that being big meant nothing if you did not know how to use your size properly. He felt like a child who had been scolded by an adult. Viper was the youngest member of the gang, and he was crying. The young man had joined the Road Devils because he wanted to feel powerful and important. But now he felt smaller and weaker than he had ever felt in his life. He realized that hurting innocent creatures did not make him strong, but actually made him the weakest kind of person possible. Jason stood in the middle of the warehouse looking down at the 5 defeated men. He was not even breathing heavily or sweating from the fight. Years of training and discipline had prepared him for situations like this, but he took no pleasure in what he had just done. He was not a bully who enjoyed hurting people for fun. He was simply a man protecting his family. "Now you know how my dog felt," Jason said in that same quiet, dangerous voice. He was surrounded by 5 big creatures who wanted to hurt him just for entertainment. He was scared and confused and in pain. He did not understand why anyone would be so cruel to him when he had never done anything wrong. The 5 bikers listened to every word without interrupting. They were beginning to understand that their victim had not been just some random animal, but someone's beloved family member, someone who could and would fight back for his loved ones. They had made the biggest mistake of their criminal careers when they decided to hurt Marcus. Jason continued speaking as he walked slowly around the group of defeated men. "My dog trusted people because he had only met good humans before you came along. You taught him that some people enjoy causing pain and fear. You damaged something pure and innocent just because you could. That makes you worse than animals because animals only hurt others when they need food or when they are protecting themselves." Tank tried to speak, but Jason held up his hand for silence. "I am not finished talking," Jason said, and Tank's mouth snapped shut immediately. "You are going to leave this town tomorrow morning, and you are never going to hurt another innocent creature again. If I hear that any of you have caused trouble anywhere, I will find you. And next time I will not be so gentle with my lesson." The Road Devils nodded their heads quickly to show they understood and agreed with everything Jason was saying. They would have agreed to anything at that moment if it meant they could leave the warehouse alive and in one piece. Their days of bullying helpless victims were over forever. The next morning brought sunshine and hope to the small town of Brighton. Mrs. Henderson was in her kitchen making breakfast when she heard a gentle knock on her front door. She looked through the window and could hardly believe what she saw. The 5 members of the Road Devils were standing on her porch, but they looked like completely different men than the cruel bullies who had terrorized Marcus just 3 days before. Tank was holding a bouquet of flowers in his big hands, and his head was hanging low with shame. Snake had removed his dark sunglasses, and his eyes were filled with genuine regret. Razor had shaved his beard and cleaned up his appearance. Bull was carrying a large bag of the most expensive dog treats he could find at the pet store. Viper looked nervous but determined to do the right thing. Mrs. Henderson opened the door slowly, and the 5 men immediately began apologizing in voices that were humble and sincere. Tank spoke first, his tough voice, now gentle and respectful. "Man, we came here to say we are sorry for what we did to your dog. We know we were wrong and we want to make things right if you will let us." Marcus heard the voices and came to the door to see what was happening. When he saw the 5 men who had hurt him, his first instinct was to run and hide. But something was different about them now. They were not standing tall and threatening like before. Instead, they were kneeling down on the porch and speaking in soft voices that did not sound scary at all. Snake reached slowly into his pocket and pulled out an envelope filled with money. "This is to pay for any medical bills the dog might have," he said, placing the envelope on the porch. "We also want to pay for anything else he needs to feel better." The money was enough to cover a year of veterinary care and premium dog food. Razor looked directly at Marcus and spoke in a voice that was shaking with emotion. "I am sorry, little guy. We were mean to you because we thought it would make us feel powerful. But it just made us feel empty and cruel. You did not deserve what we did to you, and we promise it will never happen again." Bull opened the bag of dog treats and placed it near Marcus. "These are for you," he said in his slow, deep voice. "I hope you can forgive us someday. We want to be better people than we were before." Marcus sniffed at the treats cautiously, but his tail began to wag slightly when he realized they smelled delicious. Viper was crying as he spoke to Mrs. Henderson. "We learned something important last night. Hurting innocent creatures does not make us strong. It makes us weak and cowardly. We want to spend the rest of our lives helping animals instead of hurting them. Will you please tell us how we can start making up for what we did?" Mrs. Henderson was amazed by the complete change in these 5 men. Yesterday they had been monsters who enjoyed causing pain. Today they were broken men who truly understood the evil of their actions and wanted desperately to change their ways. She could see that something or someone had taught them a lesson they would never forget. Marcus took a tentative step toward the men who had hurt him. His natural kindness and forgiving nature were stronger than his fear. When Tank reached out his hand very slowly, Marcus sniffed it and then allowed the big man to pet his golden fur. The other 4 men waited patiently for their turn to show Marcus that they were no longer dangerous. Jason watched from his car parked across the street. He had been there all morning to make sure the road devils kept their promise to apologize and make amends. A small smile crossed his face as he saw Marcus playing gently with the men who had terrorized him just days before. His beloved dog was teaching these former bullies about forgiveness and second chances. The 5 bikers spent the entire morning at Mrs. Henderson's house helping with yard work and home repairs. They washed their motorcycles and removed all the scary patches and symbols from their leather jackets. By the time they left that afternoon, they looked like ordinary men instead of frightening criminals. Tank was the last to leave. He knelt down beside Marcus one final time and spoke quietly to the dog. "Thank you for showing us how to be better," he said. "We will never forget the lesson you and your family taught us." Then he stood up and walked to his motorcycle. As the 5 men rode away from Brighton, their motorcycles no longer sounded threatening and angry. They rode slowly and carefully, respecting the speed limits and waving politely to people they passed. The road devils were gone forever, replaced by 5 men who had learned that true strength comes from protecting the innocent instead of hurting them. Marcus spent the rest of the day playing happily in Mrs. Henderson's garden with Jason watching protectively nearby. The golden retriever's trust in humans had been restored, and his tail wagged with joy as he chased butterflies and sniffed flowers. Sometimes the best lessons are learned the hard way, and sometimes people really can change when they meet the right teacher.